It's strange how quiet rules can be. There were no signs on the walls, no written lists taped to the fridge, no loud warnings. But everyone in the house knew what was allowed and what wasn't. You learned it the way you learn the sound of a clock ticking in the dark, slowly, repeatedly, without anyone needing to explain it. In our home, silence wasn't just normal, it was expected. Loud laughter felt risky. Questions felt dangerous. Even happiness had to be measured, kept small, like it might spill over and cause trouble. I learned early that being good didn't mean being happy. It meant being careful. It meant watching faces, listening for footsteps, knowing when to speak, and more importantly, when not to. There was a way to sit at the table, a way to answer questions, a way to walk through the house. You didn't run, you didn't interrupt, you didn't look confused. Confusion could be mistaken for disrespect, and disrespect was never tolerated. Punishment was never shouted about ahead of time. That made it worse. It lived quietly in the background, like a storm you could feel coming but couldn't see yet. You behaved not because someone reminded you, but because you remembered. I remember lying in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying the day in my head. I would go over every word I said, every look I gave, every moment where I might have stepped out of line without realizing it. Sleep didn't come easily. There was always the thought that maybe I had missed something. Maybe tomorrow I would find out. People outside our home thought we were well-behaved, polite, respectful. They said things like, "You've got a good kid there," and my father would nod, just once, like that was all the confirmation he needed. Inside, though, I was learning a different lesson. I was learning how to stay quiet, how to disappear a little, how to make myself smaller so I wouldn't take up the wrong kind of space. And once you learn that, it stays with you. The house itself wasn't unusual, a small American home, the kind you'd see on a quiet street where every driveway looked the same and every lawn was cut short on Saturdays. The paint inside had faded a little over the years. The furniture was sturdy, chosen to last, not to impress. Nothing was out of place because nothing was allowed to be. I grew up in a time before constant noise. No phones buzzing in pockets, no screens glowing late into the night. When the television was on, it was controlled. When it was off, the quiet felt heavy, like it had weight. My father believed in order. He believed children were shaped, not listened to. He believed respect came first and everything else followed, if it followed at all. He wasn't cruel, he wasn't loud. That almost made it harder. His calm carried authority. When he spoke, you listened. When he looked at you, you straightened without thinking. My mother moved carefully through the house. She kept things running. Meals arrived on time. Clothes were clean. She rarely challenged anything, at least not where we could hear it. If there were disagreements, they stayed behind closed doors, sealed away from us like something dangerous. As a child, I learned the rules without ever hearing them explained. You didn't need explanations. You watched. You noticed what happened when someone crossed a line. You felt the shift in the room when a voice dropped, when a chair scraped back just a little too sharply. Mornings were quiet. Breakfast was eaten quickly, efficiently. There was no lingering, no talking unless spoken to. The sound of a spoon against a bowl felt louder than it should have. I learned to chew softly. At school, teachers praised me for being attentive. I followed instructions. I didn't cause trouble. I raised my hand only when I was sure I had the right answer. Inside, though, I was always bracing, waiting for the moment I'd be told I'd done something wrong without realizing it. After school, I came straight home. I didn't ask to go out much. Asking meant attention, and attention felt risky. I stayed in my room, door open, just enough to show I wasn't hiding. I read. I drew. I learned how to pass time quietly. Every sound in the house had meaning. The front door opening, Keys setting down on the counter, footsteps moving from room to room. I could tell who was walking just by the rhythm. My body reacted before my mind did, shoulders tensed, breathing slowed. Dinner was the most controlled part of the day. We sat straight. We waited to be told we could start. We answered questions politely, briefly. No stories, no complaints. Food was food. You ate what was given to you, and you were grateful. Sometimes I watched other families. Friends at school talked about arguing with their parents, talking back, being grounded. It sounded almost unreal to me. I couldn't imagine raising my voice. I couldn't imagine saying no. In our house, obedience was never discussed. It was assumed. I didn't think of my childhood as unhappy back then. That word didn't fit. It wasn't sadness I felt most days. It was caution, a constant awareness of myself, of how I moved, of how I sounded, of how I might be seen. I learned to read my father's moods the way some kids learn to read comic books. The angle of his shoulders, the way he set his jaw, the silence that meant everything was fine, and the silence that it wasn't. Rules shaped every part of the day, even when they weren't spoken. They were in the way we sat, the way we spoke, the way we waited. They were in the way I learned to pause before reacting, to swallow words before they reached my mouth. And slowly, without anyone noticing, those rules began to shape me too. I became quieter, more careful. I learned that staying out of trouble mattered more than being understood, that being obedient mattered more than being heard. At the time, it felt normal. It was the only way I knew how to live. I still remember the day, not because of what happened, but because of what stopped happening afterward. It began like any other afternoon, quiet, predictable, the kind of day where nothing seemed out of place. I came home from school at the usual time, backpack set down in the same corner, shoes lined up the way they were supposed to be. The house felt still, almost calm, but that kind of calm always carried a warning. It meant everything was being watched, even if no one said so. I went to my room and sat on the edge of the bed. I didn't turn on the radio, I didn't lie down. I waited. Waiting had become a habit. You waited until you were sure what kind of mood the house was in. You waited until you knew what version of the evening you were stepping into. At some point, my father called my name, just once, not loud, not angry. That was worse. When he was angry, at least you knew where you stood. This was controlled, measured. I walked into the living room and stood there. He didn't look at me right away. He was sitting in his chair, the one no one else used. His hands were resting on his knees. The television was off. The room felt too quiet, like the air had been pulled tight. He asked me a simple question, something small, something that in another house might not have mattered much at all. It had to do with school, with something I hadn't done exactly the way he expected. I answered honestly. My voice sounded thin to my own ears. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't argue, he just nodded slowly like he was confirming something he already knew. There was a pause, a long one. That pause is what I remember most. The way time seemed to stretch, the way my body reacted before my mind did. My hands felt cold, my chest tightened. I remember noticing a sound outside, maybe a car passing by, and thinking how strange it was that the world kept going like nothing important was happening. He told me to stand still. His voice stayed even, calm. That calm carried more weight than shouting ever could. I remember staring at a spot on the carpet, afraid to look up, afraid not to. I didn't fully understand what I had done wrong, not really. I understood that I had disappointed him. That felt worse than being in trouble. Disappointment meant you had failed some unspoken expectation, something you were supposed to know without being told. He talked for a while, not a lecture, more like an explanation, though it didn't feel like one meant for me. It felt like something he needed to say out loud, about responsibility, about respect, about how children learned best when lessons were clear. I stood there and listened. I nodded when I was supposed to. I kept my face still. Inside, though, everything felt loud. Thoughts rushed in and out, overlapping. I wondered if this moment would end quickly. I wondered if it would last longer. I wondered if I would remember it forever. When the moment finally came, it was quiet. There was no sudden movement, no raised voice, just a shift in the room, like a door closing somewhere deep inside the house. I felt a kind of shock, not from pain, but from realization. This wasn't about correcting a mistake. This was about control, about shaping something. What stayed with me wasn't the punishment itself. It was the feeling of being completely alone in that moment, of realizing that no explanation I gave would change what was happening, that my feelings didn't factor into the decision at all. I remember thinking very clearly that something inside me had gone still, like a part of me had decided it was safer not to react, not to feel too much, not to hope for understanding. When it was over, my father didn't linger. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain further. He just told me I could go back to my room. His voice had already moved on. The house returned to its normal quiet, like nothing significant had happened. I walked down the hallway slowly. Each step felt careful, deliberate. I closed my bedroom door gently, making sure it didn't click too loudly. I sat on the bed again in the same spot as before. I waited for something to happen inside me. Tears, anger, anything. But nothing came. There was just a hollow feeling, like a space had been cleared out. That was when I realized this moment wasn't going to fade the way others had. This one had weight. It settled in my chest and stayed there. I could already feel myself pulling back, even though I didn't have words for it yet. That night at dinner, everything went on as usual. Plates clinked softly, my mother asked routine questions, my father answered calmly. No one mentioned what had happened. I answered when spoken to, I kept my voice steady. Inside, though, I was different. I wasn't confused anymore. I understood the rules more clearly than ever. I understood that obedience wasn't just expected, it was required, and it came at a cost. Lying in bed later, I stared at the ceiling again, but this time my thoughts were quieter. Something had shifted. I wasn't replaying the day, looking for mistakes. I wasn't wondering what I could do differently next time. Instead, I was learning something new. I was learning how to shut parts of myself down. I realized that asking questions didn't help, explaining didn't help, showing emotion didn't help. The safest thing was to be neutral, to stay within the lines so carefully that no one noticed you at all. That defining moment taught me exactly what was expected of me. It taught me how to obey, but it also taught me something else, something no one intended to teach. It taught me that connection wasn't part of discipline, that love and correction lived in separate rooms, and if you wanted to avoid pain, you stayed in the room with rules and silence. I fell asleep eventually, not because I felt calm, but because my mind had grown tired of holding itself so tightly together. From that day on, I carried the memory quietly. I didn't talk about it. I didn't need to. It had already done its work. And without anyone noticing, it began to change the way I moved through the world. After that day, the house didn't change on the outside. The same routines held everything together. The same times for meals, the same quiet evenings, the same expectations. But inside me, something had settled into place, something heavy and unmoving. I became quieter without meaning to, not in a way anyone would notice right away. I still answered questions, I still did what I was told, but the words I chose became fewer, safer. I learned to pause before speaking, to think through every sentence before letting it leave my mouth. Silence felt protective now. Silence felt like a shield. I started watching more than participating. I paid attention to small shifts in tone, to the sound of footsteps in the hallway, to how doors closed. I could tell what kind of evening it would be just by the way my father set his keys down. I adjusted myself accordingly. That kind of awareness becomes second nature when you grow up like that. You don't even realize you're doing it. At school, teachers called me well-behaved, polite, mature for my age. I followed rules without pushing back. I never raised my hand unless I was sure of the answer. When I didn't understand something, I stayed quiet. It was easier to be overlooked than to risk getting it wrong. Other kids laughed loudly. They complained, they tested limits. I watched them like they were speaking a language I didn't know anymore. I didn't envy them, not exactly. I just felt separate from them, like we were growing up in different worlds. At home, I stayed in my room more, not to rebel, but to stay out of the way. My room became a place where nothing was expected of me. I kept it neat, too neat. I lined things up carefully, the way I'd been taught. Disorder felt dangerous, even when no one was watching. Conversations with my father became brief and factual. He asked about school. I gave short answers. He corrected me when needed. I nodded. We didn't argue. We didn't connect either. It was like we were following a script written long before I understood my role in it. I stopped bringing my feelings to him, not because I thought he didn't care, but because I didn't see the point. Feelings didn't change outcomes. They didn't soften rules. They didn't protect you. So I learned to keep them folded away, like something fragile you didn't want to break. My mother noticed, I think. Sometimes she would look at me for a moment longer than usual, like she wanted to say something. But the house had its own balance, and no one wanted to disturb it. So those moments passed quietly, like so many others. As time went on, obedience became automatic. I didn't need reminders. I didn't need warnings. I knew exactly where the boundaries were, and I stayed well inside them. From the outside, it probably looked like discipline had worked perfectly. Inside, though, there was a growing distance, not just from my father, but from myself. I didn't ask myself what I wanted anymore. I asked what was expected. I measured my actions against rules, not feelings. I remember moments when I felt something strong rising up. Anger, sadness, excitement. And then just as quickly, I felt it flatten, like a wave hitting a wall and disappearing. I didn't push those feelings down on purpose. They just learned not to come all the way up. I became careful in ways that went beyond behavior. I was careful with my thoughts, careful with my hopes, careful not to imagine a future that felt too open or uncertain. Structure felt safer, predictable paths, clear rules. When mistakes happened, as they always do, I took them quietly. I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain unless asked. I accepted correction as a fact of life, like weather, something you adjusted to, not something you questioned. There were moments when I wondered if this was what growing up was supposed to feel like, if everyone learned at some point to close parts of themselves off. I didn't have anything to compare it to, so I assumed this was normal. But there was a loneliness in it, a quiet one, the kind that doesn't announce itself. It just sits with you day after day, until you stop noticing it's there. I carried that silence with me into my teenage years, into friendships, into new situations. I was dependable, responsible. People trusted me, but they didn't really know me. I wasn't sure I knew myself either. I avoided conflict whenever possible, not because I was afraid of disagreement, but because I associated it with consequences I didn't want to feel again. It was easier to bend than to risk breaking something unseen. Sometimes, late at night, I would lie awake and replay old conversations in my head. Not the punishment itself, but the moments around it. The pauses, the quiet, the way everything returned to normal afterward, as if nothing important had happened. Those were the moments that stayed with me. Not the rules, but the absence of warmth around them. The sense that discipline had closed a door instead of opening one. I didn't resent my father, not in a clear way. I understood that he believed he was doing the right thing, that he was trying to raise me to be strong, capable, prepared for the world. In many ways, he succeeded. But something else had been shaped too, something quieter, something harder to see. By the time I reached adulthood, obedience felt natural, silence felt familiar, and distance felt normal. I didn't realize then that these were lessons too, lessons that would take much longer to understand. And it would be years before I could look back and see not just what discipline had taught me, but what it had quietly taken away.
I didn't think about those years much once I was grown. Life moved forward the way it always does. School ended, work began, responsibilities replaced routines. From the outside, everything looked fine. I was steady, reliable. People described me as calm, even under pressure. It wasn't until much later, in quiet moments, that the memories started to come back with a different shape. Not sharper, just clearer. I began to notice how careful I still was, how often I measured my words before speaking, how silence still felt easier than honesty when something mattered. As an adult, I could finally see my father as a whole person, not just an authority. I understood where his rules came from. He had grown up in a world that valued toughness, where obedience meant survival, where love was shown through structure, not softness. He believed discipline built character, and in many ways it did. I learned responsibility early. I learned how to control myself. I learned how to meet expectations without being reminded. Those lessons stayed with me, and they helped me navigate a demanding world. But I also began to see what never had room to grow. I wasn't good at asking for help. I struggled to talk about my feelings, even with people I trusted. When something hurt, my instinct was still to go quiet, to handle it alone. I had learned that being strong meant being silent. It wasn't anyone's intention. That's what made it harder to name. Nothing about my childhood felt dramatic. There were no obvious scars, just small absences. Conversations that never happened. Comfort that never quite arrived. Over time, I realized that discipline had taught me obedience, but it hadn't taught me how to connect. It showed me how to follow rules, but not how to share myself. It kept me safe in some ways, but distant in others. I don't blame my father for that. He gave me what he knew how to give. He believed love was proven through control and correction, and I believe he loved me, even when he didn't know how to show it in ways I could feel. Understanding that brought a kind of peace. Not closure in the neat sense, but acceptance. I could hold both truths at once, that discipline shaped me, and that it took something with it. What surprised me most was realizing that it was never too late to learn the parts I'd missed, to practice speaking instead of withdrawing, to choose connection even when silence felt safer. Those lessons were harder, slower, but they mattered just as much. Now, when I think back on that house, those rules, that quiet, I don't feel anger. I feel a kind of sadness mixed with understanding, a recognition of how easily love can get lost when it's buried under good intentions. I carry those memories with more gentleness now, toward my father and toward the child I once was, standing still, learning how to disappear just enough to stay safe. If any of this feels familiar to you, you're not alone. Many of us grew up learning how to behave long before we learned how to be heard. Sometimes the quiet lessons last the longest. If you feel comfortable, you might take a moment to think about your own childhood, the rules you followed, the silences you learned, what stayed with you and what faded. If you'd like, you can share a memory or a reflection in the comments, not to judge the past, but to understand it a little better, together.